Welcome back. In this section, I want to follow up on the presentation in module 1 on the economics of bank resolution, and want to focus specifically on the phenomenon of too big to fail, and can we ever solve it? So I showed you this earlier. This is the resolution possibility frontier, where you have the trade-off between minimizing the external costs of a bank failure on the one hand, and enforcing discipline on the other hand. And as I mentioned earlier, liquidation perfectly enforces discipline, but carries with it very high external costs for all kind of stakeholders. For open bank assistance, for forbearance, bailout, minimizes the external costs of a bank failure because the bank continues to function, but it completely fails to enforce any discipline and might result in more aggressive risk-taking, which could result in more bank failures. And then you have these different methods in between. Again, they're not exclusive. They could also be a combination of these different measures. Now, what happens if it's not a small or mid-sized bank? What if it's a large bank that fails? So it's a large number of depositors, a large number of borrowers that exacerbates the economic impact of failure. Also, large banks typically have many counterparts in the financial system. Think about, again, Lehman Brothers, for example, or AIG as being the main underwriter of credit default swaps. And that can, of course, result into substantial domino effects. So what I mentioned last time, the domino, hostage, and fridge effects are much stronger for large institutions. And if one big bank fails, this might send a bad signal that others might be in trouble too, and might lead to more bank runs, for example. Now, also, the tools of resolution might not work for a large bank compared to a mid-sized or small banks. Why? Because there might be not a healthy bank that can take over a large failing bank. You might not be able to send it into partial payout plus liquidation, for example, because again, the effects on depositors and borrowers are simply too big. So there is a tendency with too big to fail institutions to ultimately bail out, either through forbearance, allow them to keep functioning, but of course that only kicks the can down the road. Open bank assistance, just bailing them out over and over again, recapitalizing them with government resources, will ultimately become a burden on countries' fiscal position. And again, we've seen in many cases. We've seen it in the 90s in Central Eastern Europe transition economies. We've seen it in Latin America in several countries where owned government-managed bank had to be bailed out over and over again, and that ultimately led to macroeconomic problems for the government. So as an alternative, there's often what is called open bank resolution, such as a bridge bank, for example, that maintains the function, but at the same time, shareholders are, for example, their claims are wiped out, or even the junior debt holder. Now, another alternative, or another way to think about this, is to simply make sure that large institutions are less likely to fail. Again, the observation being that if a small bank fails in a country, that can be dealt with. Yes, it has a negative effect, but there are enough resources, there are enough tools available to deal with it. Whereas when a large institution fails, that is much harder to manage. And therefore, having additional capital buffers, for example, TLAC for global significant financial institutions, or MREL in the European Union has been proposed, that kind of doubles the capital buffer that these banks have to hold anyway. And that is resources that can be used to bail in either as a going or as a gone concern, either in liquidation or in a resolution process. Something similar is now being introduced in South Africa in the form of FLAC for large institutions. Better prepare, also in the sense to have recovery and resolution plans. As I mentioned in the previous lecture on the key attributes, recovery plans to recover the solvency position of a institution, or resolution plan how to deal when the institution is beyond recovery and has to be resolved. Kind of being prepared for these eventualities is an important part of the of a resolution framework. Crisis management groups, many of these large banks are cross-border banks, are global banks. So again, you have to coordinate across country, also prepare for the worst case scenario and how to deal when such a global bank gets into trouble. And maybe strong statements, making sure that these banks are properly supervised, make sure that there is sufficient supervisory pressure on these institutions, but also kind of dismiss hopes that they will all be bailed out if things go wrong. And unfortunately, especially with the last one, the strong wording, sometimes supervisors, resolution authorities might have to eat their words, because yes, ex ante, it's always easy to say, we won't bail you out. When it comes to the situation, unfortunately, we've often seen that this cannot happen because authorities consider the institution too important for the local economy or even the global economy in order to not bail them out. Now, what have the recent reforms brought in terms of addressing the too big to fail? This is out of a paper that looked at funding costs of large versus small institutions. And yes, there is a funding advantage of large financial institutions compared to small institutions. Some of the recent policies, both on the regulatory side, but also on the resolution side, some even of a monetary policy, did have some effect in reducing, not in eliminating, but reducing the funding cost of large vis-a-vis small institution, which of course is positive in the sense of a more level playing field. Now, I mentioned already cross-border institution and cross-border cooperation between supervisors, but also between resolution authorities. In some recent work that I've done, we looked actually at the effect of increased cross-border supervisory cooperation on the stability of cross-border banks, and find, yes, there is a positive effect, but not for all, only for the mid-sized to large cross-border banks, not for the GSIBs. Why is that? Well, GSIBs have an easier time in shifting assets and shifting risks into third countries. So yes, the home country keeps increasing cooperation with subsidiary A and B. The cross-border bank might shift risk into country C, especially where there's less of a strong financial safety net. So there's some regulatory arbitrage which might actually counter the efforts that supervisors undertake across the globe to cooperate with each other more, including resolution authorities across border. So now coming to, you could almost argue, the elephant in the 2023 room, Credit Suisse, which was a global, systemically important bank, one of two large Swiss banks, and ultimately it failed. It did have a resolution plan, which was not implemented. There was no liquidation, there was no resolution. Rather, there was a merger acquisition with UBS, the largest Swiss bank, a so-called private sector solution. Although there was support, there were guarantees, and there was some strong arming by Swiss authorities, the Swiss National Bank, the Ministry of Finance, and the Financial Market Authority. Now, interestingly, and that has also led to quite some rankles in the financial markets, is that the ranking of investors that we discussed during the key attributes was actually violated. 81 instruments, so kind of the equivalent to subordinated debt, so the junior debt holders, they were bailed in, they lost their claims. While shareholders of Credit Suisse did receive something, not as much as the market had said, but given that there was a merger deal with UBS, they could exchange their Credit Suisse shares for UBS shares, of course, at a very steep discount. So it wasn't all according to the plan. On the upside, it was done over the weekend, and there were no contagion effects. So that's on the positive side. Again, you can argue Credit Suisse is a very idiosyncratic case. The bank had suffered from scandals and from mismanagement for a long time, but there was the fear that this could be another Lehman Brothers, and ultimately it didn't happen. But yes, the process was a quite messy one, and maybe not the best one. And ultimately, of course, the outcome is that now, instead of having too big to fail banks in Switzerland, you have one even bigger to fail bank in Switzerland. But can we ever solve it? And with this, actually, I want to conclude. Well, you can say, well, maybe not. After the recent cases, including Credit Suisse, but also some of the cases in the US that were they were mid-sized banks, it is very hard to imagine that we will ever be able to properly resolve a large bank that is market dominating in a jurisdiction. Again, what are the answers? Stronger regulation supervision to prevent fragility to rise in the first place, make it even less likely that a financial institution fails. Prepare for open bank resolution techniques. And again, you have a resolution plan, but you, as also seen in the case of Credit Suisse, you might feel the need to deviate from it. But so being prepared for the situation is an important one. We definitely need closer global cooperation. Will it be enough? Only time will tell. As an academic, I'm supposed to be a skeptic. Having been involved in policy work, I also know it is very hard when you are in the heat of the combat to really come to perfectly clean solutions. Thank you.